Bueno, vamos a iniciar nuestra conferencia de hoy. Es importante que todos ustedes sepan que estamos grabando y que está ya en YouTube la lección de ayer, ya se puede consultar en YouTube. Entonces, para todos ustedes que quieran volver a repetir o compartir con algunos de sus equipos de investigación o sus colegas y sus compañeros, pues pueden mandar la dirección y ahí ver la primera parte del curso. Hoy también estamos grabando y ya mañana volverá a estar en esta página. Vamos a trabajar igual que el día de ayer, vamos a permitir que el doctor haga su exposición y después vamos a dar oportunidad de las preguntas, vayan escribiéndolas, vayan preparándolas o algún comentario muy corto. Siempre es bueno enriquecer la visión del profesor con nuestras propias inquietudes. De hecho, pues un poco también ese es el interés por el que viene, para escuchar también lo que aquí se dice o se comenta. Y bueno, creo que la mayor parte de ustedes han estado ya en contacto con la obra de Gary Dymski aquí en la UNAM, así que seguramente podrán participar muy activamente. Entonces, nuevamente le damos las gracias al doctor Gary Dymski. Thank you, Gary, for being here with us. Y vamos a darle pues la palabra para que empecemos. Gracias a todos.
All right. So, thank you for coming to our second session, and let us have some fun with this. We are, hold on one second. It's a secret box, but I think it's okay. So, we're gonna cover the second part of our lectures today, and we'll finish tomorrow. In some sense, there's no finishing this topic. We're just opening a few doors. And what I'm going to try to do for tomorrow is to suggest some of the possibilities, for how we can build a new model. One kind of indicator of the fact that we do need something new is this picture. This is a picture of refugees in the Mediterranean Sea trying to go to Europe. And of course it's a beautiful picture, but it talks about something that's not beautiful at all, the displacement of people from their home countries that have been smashed and are not able to support them. And in some sense, this dynamic of countries in crisis, spaces that cannot support their populations, or can only do that if they provide resources to other places. The dynamic of inequality and so on, we have to get a handle on the core reasons why it exists and then what we can do about it. And so tomorrow I'll throw out a few ideas. I'll finish the story that I'm telling about how we got to this point. I will be cutting, if you're interested in the subprime crisis and the problem of financial exclusion and the emergence of financial exclusion over time, that's been a huge topic for my research over the last maybe 20 years. In fact, I suppose I'm one of the co-inventors or something of this topic, of this concept, although frankly what we thought was since we invented financial exclusion and then it became financial inclusion, and then the World Bank made a big projects about it, now we want to kill this concept because it became something different than we were talking. However, tomorrow I won't say very much, I'll say much less about that. If you're interested, we can talk later, and I can share with you ideas or where I think that research is going. There's some interesting things, but I do want to give myself the challenge of trying to answer that question: what is the new global model that will move us forward? I think it might be like listing elements, but it will be useful to do that. Now, where we are today, so actually, so we're in the middle part. You see the red part, there's where we're going to go today. And we're first of all going to talk about the way in which the globalization of the economy in the post-Bretton Woods era affected the global South, and then the ways in which this was discussed, explained by orthodox and heterodox people. And then we'll look at the lending cycles, and then we'll look at the emergence of power and finance. One of my themes for sure about we need a new global model is that we need to take the power out of global finance. That has to be done, and how it's to be done we began to discuss last night, but very difficult topic. So that those last topics, I think I'll shrink those a little bit more so there's time to talk about things. I mean, we can talk forever about shadow banking and so on, but I think we'll keep that simple so we have time to get to new ideas. Okay, now let's go to basically the global South and what happens as we move from the Bretton Woods era into what will become the neoliberal era. And so let's just set the scene. And we can, in a sense, do this by looking at the borrowing and lending side. I'm going to, the demand for funds and the supply of funds, I'm going to do it this way because this phase is going to turn into a financial crisis that's going to hit Latin America very hard and leave a stain that remains to this day, actually. So looking at it in this way and thinking of the credit market, on the supply side, you have the fact that there was the expanded price of oil led to lots of surpluses for the oil exporting countries. At that point, we were talking about OPEC. And this money needed to be recycled. So it was deposited in banks and recycled, and so they're looking for uses for this money. Now the thing is that whilst this revenue, whilst this is happening, at the same time, keep in mind that we mentioned that the banking systems in the United States and in England and elsewhere are all under pressure. The pressures of disorganized markets, especially rising inflation, unstable exchange rates, and if we look at the case of Europe, and other factors are really putting pressure everywhere on the existing systems of finance. And basically, one idea that occurred was there was a very famous report called the Club of Rome report. It's called Limits to Growth. And the Limits to Growth report was a key marker in the discourse of human beings about global sustainability, because published in 1974, this report, I think its main author was Hirsch, talked for the first time about limits to growth, the fact that there were only so many non-renewable resources, and people began to do serious counts for the first time about the extent of, let's say, natural resources of various kinds, including petroleum. And so basically what was seen was that a scarce natural non-renewable good, oil, was just proven to be able to command monopoly prices. So the thought was, well, other places could do that too. And places that had reserves of natural resources would represent this untapped development potential. And of course, this led people to think about Latin America. And meanwhile, at the same time, there was this problem of, as we mentioned, the banks were breaking down. Their relationships they were losing their established relationships with their borrowers as well as with their depositors. The depositors were going into money market mutual funds, whilst the large-scale and important borrowers were going into their own markets. The commercial paper markets and other financial markets really began to take off in that period, and they left banks behind. So the banks needed a new place to invest, and they turned their eyes to the fact that they could make loans to resource-rich countries, and it looked like win-win-win, because there was lots of resource. The belief was that a country doesn't go bankrupt, and we can go from there. Now, bringing us to Latin America. Latin America was perfect in terms of the demand for credit that these banks could offer. These were big markets, resource-rich nations, the big three in particular, and basically it was going to be possible to use Euro market branches and other facilities to bundle these loans and to do it in a way that would spread the risks and so on. This was the time when some of the offshore facilities, Euro markets, were really emerging as well. Now, the thing is that what this meant, however, was a shift in the policy orientation of the banks. Now, I'm sitting next to Eugenia, and she's an expert in this and has written many books and studies, along with colleagues here, about the ways in which these shifts have affected the integrity and the coherence of Latin American credit systems. So, you know, here I'm the student sitting before the master here. But just to say that this was part of it, that essentially there had been a model called financial repression, and that model basically means keep your financial system under control. Often these financial systems would be publicly owned. The financial systems would be seen as instruments of development. And this legacy exists today only in a few places. One of them is Germany, another is Brazil, and so on. And it was common for nations coming out of colonialism to insist that they control their finance. But the price of opening up to this flow of credit was to begin to liberalize these markets and these firms. And this was a step that, you know, we went along that way. And now we start to walk the crisis road then. Now, yesterday we saw those dramatic pictures of what Paul Volcker did. If you remember how crazy the interest rate picture got, that of course triggered a recession in the United States and elsewhere in the world. And now that was, you know, by purpose, and it had this double impact. One thing was that this kind of, you know, inflationary, now let me just say that many of the economies in Europe, US, and in the global north were already in some kind of stagnation, high inflation cycle, but they were slowly growing, or more slowly than they had in the past. And basically what this did was to launch a situation of depression, or very serious recession, if not depression. And basically it looked like, you know, we had this problem though, that as the recession hit, it caused what had been a boom in commodity prices to really fall. And as that happened, basically the countries that had been exporting commodities and making money from that included some parts of the United States, really began to implode, and their economies went down, and they were often counting on basically having robust revenues from commodity sales in order to sustain their debt loads. And I think here we're sitting in the room named after one of the founders of the economics here, and it's his son, wasn't it, who was renegotiating all the debts in those days. And basically, though, there was a situation where, best described by Carlos Diaz Alejandro, who wrote a famous paper called Goodbye Financial Repression, Hello Financial Crash. So, you know, you end your regulated system, you open the economy, you take big risks, you let in the foreign money, and basically it's based on a commodity bubble. The bubble goes, and then the economies crash. So this, you know, debt crisis in Latin America, which breaks out when Mexico defaults in 1982 on its obligations, followed by Peru and then followed by other countries, leads into this situation in which essentially, you know, what had been a kind of rolling crisis turns into a declared crisis. Now, this was something very important, because until that moment, the notion was that debt was only bad if you declared it to be bad. And so if you rolled over debt and you just provided more loans, you know, then in some sense, you would know that the company was using the old loan to pay off the new loan, or the new loan to pay off the old loan, but you wouldn't have to say that. So there was a kind of game between borrowers and lenders of let's pretend. And it finally, however, got to the point where it was impossible to pretend. Mexico goes into default. Latin American experience is a lost decade. Here's a picture of that lost decade. And so, well, actually, we go from 73, and let's just look here. Say, first of all, we have Brazil. We see this one here. Here's Brazil in the 70s, growing pretty robustly. And then you see there's this kind of downturn, a second downturn, and then a period of slight recovery, and then downturn, downturn, and downturn. So Brazil goes through a series of things. Now that's the end of the dictatorship period too, a complicated period in Brazil. Mexico, meanwhile, is here. We have Mexico that goes along, has a kind of boom. Now here's this lending-fed boom. It's also an oil-fed boom. And then Mexico economy goes down, bounces up a little bit, goes down again, takes another dip, and then goes into the next phase. But there was a loss of momentum here. Argentina has the most chronic booms and busts. Notice how their cycle is faster and basically more unstable. That characteristic has been true of Argentina ever since. And it has something to do with the structure of the Argentine economy. They have some very narrow ways in which they can sell to the outside world, and that is reflected in a very, very unstable economy, which haunts them to this day. Now, in this period, what was happening was that we saw that basically Japan had been catching up with the United States. And and here's a picture, however, of something that also happened in this period, because we're now going to turn from that specific thing to actually, what happened and something we want to point out, which is that, notice that in this period here, up until the late or middle 1980s, notice that the implication of this trend line is that the Japanese economy is actually growing much faster than the U.S. economy, and it's in danger of taking off and actually beating the U.S. economy. If you looked at this in terms of size of GDP, the U.S. GDP was like this, and the Japanese, how about like this, and the Japanese economy was going like this. I mean, they could see the catch-up point, and that was a threat to the U.S. leadership of the global system. And Japan had the biggest banks in the world. China does now. And basically, one other thing that happened in that time period was that there was a move to basically slow down the Japanese economy and force Japanese investment inward. Now, that happened. But as that was done, that fed an asset bubble in Japan, in both the asset market and in the housing market, that then burst in 1990. And ever since then, that had the effect of destroying the balance sheets of many of the big Japanese banks. It had the effect of loading many Japanese consumers and households with debt that they could not repay, but they had to keep paying, but they could not get out from under the debt because their housing prices had collapsed, and of actually leading to the kind of immobilization of the Japanese economy. It was almost like a mafia hit by Volcker and his associates on the Japanese economy. Now, I'm not sure if we'll get back to that, but let's just turn for the minute to, we'll go back now to Latin America, and what did people think they learned? Now, here is where, as mentioned, this turn from rolling over debt and pretending it was still good debt to basically a country, in this case Mexico, saying we can't pay, we need to stop, we need to renegotiate, etc. That was a turn that was very important. That was a marker that changed the way that the global economy worked. One of the things it does is something we'll be talking about tomorrow. It led to the need to renegotiate, and if I can just comment, the renegotiation was complicated because if you think of it, it wasn't, in some sense, it's not that like Citibank made a loan to something called Mexico. No, Citibank made loans to companies in Mexico who were carrying out various plans. And some of these countries, and these were different loans, they had different terms and conditions, they had different, you know, participants, et cetera. And this, of course, was true for every bank. You had a wide diversity of loans that had been made. And that wide diversity of loans was a problem because, you know, well, on the one hand, the loans had landed with the nation. They were now Mexico's obligation. But in some sense, they were still individually contracts that had very specific clauses and conditions attached. And what do you do? Well, actually, what was done was to renegotiate and reimagine the terms and conditions of repayment of each one of those loans. In every case, there was some participation and some payment by the Mexican government. There was payment and participation by some of the international authorities and by the United States was, you know, that played a part, the Fed played a part, and the banks did some forgiveness. But the upshot was that these different participants made an agreement that put these loans that were very diverse into the same category, and they all piled into something called a Brady bond. Now, the Brady bond then becomes an instrument that is then floated on the international market. Now, we'll pick up what happens later, but the thing that's significant for our purpose right now is that this was a moment when the renegotiations involved the active participation of the U.S. and Mexican governments. They were not, however, following U.S. law nor Mexican law. They were making up agreements and arrangements that were acceptable to the community of global banks. There was no statutory authority. There is no purely international law. There's no such thing that exists in this case. There's multilateral agreements and so on, but there's nothing like something you can appeal to. So instead, this was essentially large banks and large governments, especially the United States, taking a crisis into its own hand and superseding national authority. Nation states, national governments were no longer the ultimate authority over what happened in their national space. In fact, they were merely participants in a global market that was bigger than them and more important than them. And if these governments didn't participate and didn't play by the rules, they could be punished, and they deserved to be punished. So the notion that if you think about, say, Karl Polanyi and the Great Transformation and the vision of the, this energy, this yin and yang relationship of state and market as being used to navigate our way through modern space and modern time, and to, you know, slow down the reactions of the market and to protect the people. In some sense, this balance turns. And we see this in the way that the Orthodox theory understands this crisis. So this vision, this notion that the nation state is just a borrower, it's just a bad borrower if it doesn't pay, and it should be punished like any other borrower, begins to actually embed itself in economic theory, and it remains embedded to this day. So it's not that, you know, hey, the state, you know, creates the conditions for the market and has the power over the market. No, completely reversed. So what we see is three kinds of models that emerge. One is this, kind of efficient market models of financial crisis, which picks up with a public choice approach. We'll talk briefly about that, I think. Then there's principal agent models of financial crisis, which become the dominant strand. And this new Keynesian micro foundations without the macro, the most important article is this one by Stiglitz, Eaton, and Gersowitz called The Pure Theory of Country Risk, published in 1986, trying to summarize what people thought they had learned. And then thirdly, there was also, among orthodox approaches, there was the notion that we have unreliable agents. So essentially, let's start with efficient market approaches. So basically what we have here is the idea that agents are rational, information should be freely available, or the price movements should reveal it. And if markets are deep enough, then every saver can manage their own risk-taking. In this sense of a fully developed set of of financial markets, you know, what we have is a situation in which basically the structure, the institutional structure of markets becomes irrelevant. The Modigliani and the structure of financial instruments also becomes kind of blended together. The Modigliani-Miller theorem says that in efficient markets, it doesn't matter whether a firm is equity financed or debt financed, because what's being financed is a set of core activities that can be understood by the efficient agents providing the finance. And so it doesn't matter how it's financed, it's just that is it financeable. And then Fama comes along in 1980 and writes an important article called the Banking and a Theory of Finance that talks about the way in which in efficient markets banks don't matter, because whatever choices they make are merely subsets of choices that would be made anyway by the market, so banks can affect nothing. So in this vision, when you have something like, you know, disturbances to equilibrium, where can that come from? Well, it has to do with some external force pushing on the market. Now that it basically is going to be government interference. Government interference ends up being used all the time by people who insist that if financial markets are efficient generally, or want to be efficient, and if we have a crisis, it must be a failure of government. This is a long discussion, but we see this right now in the discussion about the subprime crisis, and we saw it back then as well. And essentially, the notion that specifically came up in the Latin American crisis, it was then repeated even by Krugman in his first analysis of the Asian crisis, is this notion that there's people who are unwilling to honor their contracts, people who are not good players, they're not honest players in the markets. And why? Well, because of political interference. There's a feeling that, you know, for example, crony capitalism, the market game that was what Krugman talked about in 1997, or 98, I guess it was January. And this goes along with the fact that, well, countries don't go bankrupt, so said Walter Wriston of Citibank. Therefore, if bankruptcy was declared, then it must be political interference. Now, let's turn then, though, to basically the principal agent problem approach, because this approach became dominant and is still used heavily today. So this 1986 paper, The Pure Theory of Country Risk, basically they ask a few questions. So why do debt crises occur, and then why don't people, you know, what happens? And basically, you know, what they say is, well, here's this quote, you know, we're going to articulate this as, we're going to articulate very general principles for looking at the most essential problems posed by international lending. So in other words, we're being signaled here that these authors are understanding that what they are doing is describing a general phenomenon that can be accurately described by a mathematical model that takes into account the core characteristics. So what you just saw happen is something that we know we could describe within the logic of this model. Okay, and basically what happens to the loan is a result of a series of decisions, not the mechanical realization of some outcome. So in some sense, what's happening, what the difference here between this and efficient markets is, in efficient markets, it's the notion that everybody's playing along and somehow the government messes up the game. But here, we're going to analyze what is the logic of the decisions. Well, let's talk about borrowers first. Borrowers, they have basically, there's a question of whether or not they will pay. Moral hazard. The borrower can choose to repay or not to repay. And basically, there is a thought that in the case of this crisis, now keeping in mind this quote right here, countries don't go bankrupt, that since countries don't go bankrupt and countries are resource rich, that's why the loans were made, right? Then what that implies is that it must be something about these countries that they don't want to pay. So there's a moral hazard problem. The resources are always adequate to repay the loans. So we've got this problem here. And so, you know, essentially, this is just a slide that contrasts the two approaches. These theories both see asymmetric information, missing information, problems of the truthfulness of lenders, and so on as being at the core of it. So we have this kind of approach that's taken. And, you know, what we have to find is that somewhere there's a perverse incentive mechanism. And this leads to the notion that what we must do whenever we see a crisis, especially including a crisis of a country, is we must look at how could the market have broken down? What mechanism could make things better again? So the thing is that, you know, for Stiglitz and his co-authors, if you just free up these markets, it can be a real problem because you have asymmetric information, you can't trust people, and so on. So what you need to do is to set up regulations with fair rules. And that is something that basically can be done if the country is willing to essentially discipline its cheating borrowers and also get rid of its incompetent lenders. Okay, so the principal agent problem, okay, I think you've probably seen this, but just in case, it arises essentially in general terms. Let's go with Stiglitz for the minute. It's a situation where you have on one hand, one agent, a principal, and another agent, well, one is a principal, then there's an agent. The principal is an entity that controls some scarce resource that the agent needs to survive or to undertake some enterprise. In this case, it's access to credit. So you've got plans, you've got potential, you've got oil in the ground, or you've got magnesium or titanium, but you can't get it out of the ground unless you get access to money. And so essentially, there is, that if it is the case that there is only one agent here that can provide that, then that agent has got some power. So there's a question of kind of the asymmetry of who faces many options in a market and who faces just one. In the case of the lender holding money, they can make loans to many different kinds of entities. Of course, they can not make loans at all. They've got choices. If these people controlling resources here want to develop, they're going to have to come to lenders sooner or later. So they lack power in that relationship. And so essentially, there is, you know, a problem for the principal. Although this is an empowered agent, this is an empowered principal, it's got the ability to walk away, and it's got the control of the resource. It doesn't know certain things about the agent. It doesn't know how good the agent is, or how truthful, how willing to repay that agent is. In the case of a labor market, it would be how good are they, how capable, and then how hard will they work. In the case of a borrower, will they default? So this creates a problem that has to be solved. And the solving of the problem is basically one that involves, you know, the certain characteristics. Essentially, this problem will emerge, first of all, when there's some conflict between the two. Now, the conflict between the two will come because this agent is going to do some activity that's going to generate gains for that activity. Now, the gains earned will be more, all things equal, if they can walk away to their obligation to pay off the loan, or if they can basically enjoy their salary in the case of a labor market, but not put out much effort so they don't get so tired and they can enjoy the rest of the evening. And so there's a problem wherein the principal has to find a way to make for incentive compatibility, to make the agent do what the principal wants them to do. And this can be by either controlling their effort or controlling for type. Now, essentially, the type that's relevant here, I'll just say that you know, the type we're going to focus on here is the problem of effort. And the thing is, if agent's effort is variable, then the agent is inclined to cheat. Like when Mexico says we can't pay, maybe they're just a cheating agent. So essentially, you know, they're going to do things that you don't want them to do. So you've got to basically have the ability to do one of two things: to induce them to cooperate, or to pay a penalty, to give them a stick, to punish them. And essentially one of these two things is going to be necessary to make it all work. So here's a model, and what they say is that, for example, you know, in a case like this, you have, it would seem that a model would go to equilibrium where here's a demand for credit and here's a supply of credit, and you would think the equilibrium would be here at R2, but actually what they suggest is that, well, no, actually in the case of moral hazard, there's going to be maybe an equilibrium at R1. Reason is that basically, notice that what's happening here is that there's a limited supply of credit for a much greater amount of demand at this point in the market. What that implies is that basically the lender can pick and choose among borrowers. So if the borrower doesn't repay, it can just say, you know, bye-bye and go to a new borrower and find another equilibrium. So that's a form of power over this entity. And so essentially there's this kind of thing. Let's skip the adverse selection and basically just go to the pure theory model. The way it works out here is that essentially they set up a model and it goes like this. The borrower, right, receives a benefit from this loan. And so they get some benefit from it. And if they pay the loan back, it costs them R of L, R times the loan. And if it defaults, it pays a penalty P star. So basically what the borrower is doing is the borrowing is examining two states of the world. One state of the world is basically they're comparing what do they get at the end of the day if they get the loan, do the project, and then pay back the loan. They compare that with what happens if they get the loan and default. And basically, they will repay if the utility to the company from repaying is more than the utility if they default. Notice that which thing they do depends on P. You know, and essentially, notice that essentially, if you have a P star that is, you know, if the penalty is not sufficient, then basically they will always default. But basically, if the utility, so essentially if that P star is huge, then essentially it will be cheaper for them. They'll get more utility by going there than going there. So essentially, Mexico doesn't repay, Brazil doesn't repay, the penalty wasn't high enough. So you have to make the penalty higher. And basically, that's something that will happen. And actually, the conclusion of this analysis is they say, well, it's surprising there's been as much lending as there has been, because how serious is anybody about doing penalties for borrowers that don't pay when they're sovereign debtors? Okay, now, if you think about what Wolfgang Scheibel just did in Germany to the case of Greece, when Greece was not able to meet its obligations, and he made the Greek economy suffer and crawl. I think that was a case where actually they were not afraid to impose that penalty, and but it's not that things got simpler. Okay. Now we're going to get back to that. We're going to get back to the frame of what happened, but let me just lay out very quickly, I think, a few stories about other stories told. There's some interesting writing by Ha-Joon Chang in the Cambridge Journal of Economics. It came in the wake of the Asian crisis, because he was still an undergrad and then in the streets of Korea protesting when the Latin American crisis came out. But by year 2000, he was a professor at Cambridge, and he wrote this very important article about the hazard of moral hazard. And essentially, you know, we can then talk about some other kind of approaches that talk about what happened. Okay. Basically, I'll just mention that Ha-Joon paper, and we'll move on basically to kind of approaches that look at how the global economy is structured and what happened. One very important paper and book, actually, was written by Sandy Darity and Bobby Horn. It's called The Loan Pushers. book came out about 1987. And what they do is they basically, they take, if you know the approach that I think you've talked about, we've brought it up in our writing sometimes, the Sheila Dow, Vicky Chick idea of segmented regional credit markets, and the fact that if you have a country or a credit market that has a core and a periphery, it's often the case that the core gets a saturation of loans, the periphery doesn't get much, and in a crisis there's a kind of centralization. And so this idea, in some sense, was taken by Darity and Horn, and they just generalized it to the global case. And they talk about the fact that essentially you have a set of segmented global markets, and there are some markets in the periphery that are last served, except when there's a surge of loanable funds that in the global north they're looking to lend, and in that case the tidal wave will rise, the water will flow, it will come in a splash all over all places, including into the periphery, and the loans will go there. And they argue then that when that happens, it's even that the loans are pushed. And I think if you, actually Ambassador Herzog came one time to UC Riverside and gave a talk, again, the Herzog, who had renegotiated the debt, and he was talking about the debt crisis, and he talked about the loan pushing phenomenon, that, you know, in the good days when the loans were being made and Mexico was commodities rich and it looked like it would be rich beyond all imagination and the commodities prices would never fall, that he had borrowers lined up in his office, out the door, you know, just deal after deal after deal. Everybody wanted to get a piece of that rising market. Well, that, says Darity and Horn, is part of a phenomenon. It's part of a broader phenomenon of a boom-bust cycle that encompasses, you know, where we have the monopoly center controlling the supply of credit and having the power there, pushing out into the periphery when it has loans to make and excess capital. And so that's something that was talked about there. And in this analysis, borrower countries are dependent, not free actors. And so the thing is about this, that this really raises the question of the colonial legacies. Now, I got this one, and we got, see, Cesar is here, so we're going to do some history right now. Because Cesar came over to Leeds, and by the way, if you have a chance and you're working on your doctorate, to come and spend some time at Leeds to work on your research, we welcome you to come there. But Cesar came there, and here's a little bit of history for you. Now, this is data that's no longer available, but I collected it while it was still available. This is collected by the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements, and what was valuable about these data is that, so these are BIS reporting banks. So the Bank for International Settlements only takes care of what they call now the systematically important banks. So the very largest institutions, they must report to the BIS. Of course, there's a whole story there. They're getting more worried. They make more ones report. Now they have all these tests that they try to implement. But basically, for this period of time, for the banks reporting to the BIS, they recorded both the loans that they were making that were being made to any given country, and then they were recording the country of origin of the lender. So you could track where was the loan going and where did the loan come from. Now, as mentioned, these data actually stopped existing in this year right here, 2003. That's the last time they reported those data as such. But since they reported it, I said, let's do some analysis. So first of all, this is international claims by these big banks on developing nations. You can see there's Africa at the bottom. Eastern Europe becomes a thing. Latin America, was a thing and becomes a thing again. And then we get to Argentina. And then Asia Pacific. And there's our, rise. And then we have the flavor of the week. East Asia, lending bubble, bursting in 97, and then comes down. Okay. Now let's see who lends where. First of all, let's look who lends to Latin America. Okay, so from the Darity Horn Global Center Periphery perspective, who would bring those loans back to Latin America? Oh, I don't know. how about Spain and the U.S.? Has a certain historical ring to it. Not too much involvement by the other banks. Let's go to Asia Pacific. Japanese banks, and to some extent American banks, and to some extent UK banks. Let's go to Africa. French, German, UK, right? It's a pattern. It's a pattern that reflects a colonial legacy, and that legacy remains. And of course, right now, I know that Alicia is doing a project where she's getting into, or broadening a project where she's been developing a Asia Study Center, China Study, and so on, Japan, and so on, here at UNAM, and now it's getting into Africa. And it would be very, very interesting. I know they're trying to identify some data that allows you to put pictures like this together to see what the patterns are now. But this pattern certainly reflected that theory that was held. I'll just mention a paper that I did with Manuel Pastor. I don't think I want to get you into all of it, but basically what we did, and this was a kind of lesson. This is on a day when I got the mainstream power establishment to talk to me. We played some politics, and they came knocking on our door this morning. So that was a nice moment, because basically the mainstream power establishment doesn't usually like to play with us. And so Manuel and I saw these, like we saw that, pure theory of country risk and these other articles, borrower country. We said, that's the dumbest model ever. There's no such thing as a borrower country. Actually, there are agents within country. The country itself has a structure. There's elected politicians, there's workers, there's capitalists, there's bankers, there's a whole structure of the economy that's there, and actually that's what's happening. And so when a loan comes into Mexico or Brazil or Argentina, actually what's happening is that it's coming into this complex nexus of a structure of economic interrelations that are also loaded with political significance. So let's talk about that. So we basically said, let's break the myth of the single player, the country as player, and instead, make a richer analysis. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through this model, but basically, what we just indicated was kind of the action of the model was up here in this first part. Once the crisis came, we kind of said, why is there a payments crisis, a payments problem? And so what we did is we kind of set the historical model in motion. And so, what you have is that your borrower country is going along, and then basically the commodity price falls, so adjustments have to be made. So how are those adjustments to be made? And we pointed out that there's tension, there's a problem. Basically, you can do, how do you signal effort? Now, this is using the language of that model. How do you signal that you're a good borrower? You're going to make a strong effort to repay. Well, first of all, you can go and you can reduce your wage share in your country. You can put pressure on your workers. You can slow down welfare payments. You can do a variety of things. We had a kind of neo-Kaleckian setup, so we just said you can cut wages, cut wage share. Or you can reduce government spending. And basically, if you do that, then you show that you're a good borrower and that the lenders should continue to play with you. What we pointed out, though, is that essentially that's not so simple, that there's, in that structure of economic interactions, that when you start cutting government and welfare and cutting wages, there's going to be reactions. There are going to be political reactions, and there's going to be reactions based on class power and class conflict. And these things will lead in very complicated ways. And so that can lead to, a situation where it's not going to go so smoothly. So don't talk about borrower country. Talk about the structure of power and the interaction between politics and economy in the borrower nation. Now, we thought we had some empirics, and we had a nice model. See, it was a model, and we sent it to mainstream journals, and we got shot down so fast it made your head hurt. You're just like, chung, you're out. Because who was the paper sent to? Well, at the Journal of Development Economics, it was sent to it was sent to Eaton, and at the other journal, it was sent to Gersowitz. And they were like, no, we don't want any competition. We have the model. Let's keep it simple. So they did. But now what happens, right, is that we see this problem, and here's a different way of seeing the lost decade. You know, looking at different countries and looking at the US and the UK, and the fact that in the 70s and in the 60s, Brazil and Mexico and Argentina, well, Argentina, again, is kind of a very special case always in Latin America. I won't tell you any of my jokes that are said in Brazil and about that, because it goes to another place. But basically, you can see the lost decade right here. And you can see there's some recovery, but notice that the case has remained very complicated for these nations after a brief period of recovery. We're going to get to what happened here later in our story. Now, essentially, the other thing we might do is try to apply the financial instability hypothesis. We mentioned yesterday that Hyman Minsky, his theories really are this notion that they applied mainly to the U.S. case from the era of sort of the golden age of capitalism, but we can adapt his model for analyzing the case of developing economies. Basically, to say people can make mistakes, that basically there's firms and enterprises that have to commit real resources in uncertain environments. In advanced economies, these firms can leverage their borrowings more perhaps than they can in developing economies. But basically, we have a problem wherein expectational flux really leads to change. So, we have instances of Latin America, then Mexico in '94, then land bubbles in '87 and through '90, in Japan and in Korea. Then we have equity market bubbles and all kinds of bubbles everywhere that are very Minskian, that talk about booms and busts in asset markets in which too much lending goes in. And we would have to add to those basically, that these are not going to play out, though. These often involve, in many cases, cross-border lending. So we're going to add to this that there's going to be open economy features. There will be exchange rate volatility, you'll have different levels of wealth and reserves, and there will be problems of cross-border balance to consider. And we have kind of a new pattern that emerges of overseas lending and borrowing. From the 1970s onward, I think we can detect a pattern like this. First, we see the perception, there's a country with good growth prospects, let's all go there. And it's something, right? It's either they're urbanizing, or they're exporting a lot, or they have a lot of resources. There's something there. Then the second part of the pattern is that there's a rush of lending, and there's a competition by lenders to get in on the market. They compete to be there first. Then there's a shock event that causes expectations to be disappointed, and then after that, there's a withdrawal of lending, or a refusal to lend more. This is sometimes termed by Guillermo Calvo as a sudden stop. And then there's a period of recovery until they do it again. And so this pattern repeats again and again and again. There's this flux of money around the world in a very unstable boom-bust pattern. And of course, this kind of bubble-led growth is increasingly seen now, today, because we have the kind of collapse of Keynesian-style growth, which is the kind of non-bubble growth. So this is just to say that, some analysts look at this, and we see markets that, some people talk about sunspots, some people talk about sudden stops, and actually then the IMF and World Bank, they assemble this big data set, and they argue through Reinhardt and Rogoff in this now famous book. This time it's different. Of course, the book means this time it's never different is the real meaning there. And basically, so it's to say, well, this pattern is so perpetual that it must be inherent in human nature. It must be part of a behavioral sequence. It's not part of the developing pattern of a global economy with a hegemon and a periphery and a history and a past. It's just something that happens all the time. And so this is something that, you know, we see, but here's some of the kind of stories of, or pictures of what happened. We see, first of all, that, I want you to see a couple of things about this. Notice that there was, because this is something that's going to come up tomorrow as we think about we need a new model. The first thing we got to do is we got to stop these financial crises. Well, it's not the first thing, but it's one of the first things. We got to stop these financial crises. Now, if you take a look, now let's just stay with the 20th century here. Where's my finger? Here we go. You see that there was lots of exchange rate crises, but there was actually some exchange rate crises, growing number, but then there's lots and lots of banking crises. Now, these are the years after World War I, and notice that what we have here is a shift from the gold standard to the kind of instability of the interwar years, and what we have then is, you know, more banking problems as those economies go down. Now, more or less, there's a stabilization of government policies and some controls imposed over finance. And, and those controls lead to basically a world in which essentially the number of banking crises go down to almost nothing. Now, however, what happens in those years, now remember this 1945 to 1971 period is a period of the Bretton Woods period, of the Bretton Woods system. There are still a lot of exchange rate crises because basically everybody's trying to stay inside the same zone. People are trying to stay with the Bretton Woods system, and it's not easy, and there's many failures. Once we, however, leave the Bretton Woods system, we have a continued large number of failures there, lots of exchange rate crises, and then banking crises come back. And just to say, here's a picture for, you know, where these IMF people, they've tried to put together banking and currency and sovereign debt crises. And just to say that there's been a lot, and there's been a peak. The whole point I really wanted to show you here is just that there's been a peak of these things in the neoliberal era. Once we end the Bretton Woods period there, we enter this kind of regime of all kinds of crises. And this especially affects Latin America. There's all kinds of problems that show up in this database. And what I'm doing here, by the way, the peaks, this is just counting crises. This is just like one crisis equals one, two crises equal two. So you're just keeping score of how many crises there are, you know, of different kinds in different years. And notice that there's a huge peak in the early 90s. That huge peak has to do with the combination of Eastern Europe coming online and the European economies, the Western European economies, having a lot of trouble as they were trying to lock down coming into what was going to become the euro. But here we go, and you see in Latin America, crises all over the place, very frequently. And sovereigns are sometimes involved, but often not involved. And so that's just to say. So basically, you know, we have other approaches that I want you to know about, just if you're analyzing financial crises. There's people now that are taking more realistic approaches and different approaches than the principal agent models. And unfortunately, well, fortunately or not, the approach that's becoming very popular is called the limits to arbitrage approach. It was set up by Vishny and Schleifer, so it appears, I can send you the article if you'd like to see it, but basically the idea is that we have to take into account in analyzing a situation, not just the contract, like the principal-agent relationship, the borrower, the lender, the investor, and the investee, but we also have to take into account the size of the market. That if the market is too small relative to the number of transactions being made, that the limits on the market can make it impossible to make efficient market deals. Now, this is not news to us, but this notion of tension between the size of the market and then the deals and the contracts that can be made is an important kind of device to work with. And some of the people doing that are Brunemeyer and Nagel, Geniakopoulos, and others. And this is something being used now to explain financial crises. Okay, let's now get to our last part for today, which is about power in finance and hegemonic power and too big to fail. Now, we're going to get to part 2 about power and finance tomorrow. But what I want to emphasize, and the reason this is an important start of our journey, or an important stop in our journey, is that the bailout of the big banks in 2008 and in through, the way in which the Fed and the Bank of England, and not so much the European Central Bank, stepped in to save the global financial system by saving the big institutions. This is not something that was invented on the spur of the moment in the heat of the crisis in 2008. This is something that is basically was set up as part of the global system of finance back in the 1980s. It was not an invention, it was a plan. Now, the crisis was not a plan. The crisis was a consequence of the plan, but the plan remained. You know, the plan to set up institutions that are too big to fail, that are unaccountable, that are unregulatable, and that can hold world markets hostage. This was precisely the plan that was elaborated, and actually it was elaborated on as the other side of the transaction when the Latin American debt crisis happened. So let's talk about that. Now, you know, a conspiracy of bankers. This is John Maynard Keynes. You know, it's hard to read Keynes quotes because there's a lot of music in those quotes. But basically, it's the business of a banker to maintain appearances and profess a conventional respectability. So that's a nice phrase. Lifelong practices make them the most romantic and least realistic of men. Now, that's a classic Keynes sentence. He just loves him. You know, Keynes' problem, right? He's got a few problems. One is that he loves himself too much. He thinks he's the most intelligent guy ever. And when he writes a sentence like that, he's like, oh, that sentence is too beautiful to erase. It has nothing to do with the rest of what he says, but why not? Okay, then it is their stock in trade that they, you know, what he's really after is, right, conventional respectability. It is so much their stock in trade that their position not be questioned and that they do not even question it themselves until it is too late. Like the, okay, now irony, another thing Keynes uses all the time, like the honest citizens they are, sorry for that, they feel a proper indignation at the perils of the wicked world in which they live, when the perils mature but they do not foresee them. A banker's conspiracy, the idea is absurd. I only wish there were one. So if they are to be saved, it will be, I expect, in their own despite. Now, basically, he's actually forecasting what ends up to be the banker's conspiracy that emerges in the 1980s to save them from the Latin American debt crisis, when the combination of the top 11 banks in the United States had more bad loans from Latin America than they had equity. They were bankrupt, but they did not go bankrupt because the plan was put in motion. Now, let's just, you know, let's just turn to my favorite, well, one of my favorite quote machines. The all-time favorite is Jamie Dimon, but here's Lloyd Blankfein, who's also a good quote machine, and he says this. Now, this is Blankfein. Now, check it out, and it's too bad Alicia's not here, because notice the date, first of all, May 20th, 2010. He has 4 months before testified at the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission and said basically like, we're not ashamed, we're a principal, we do what we want to do, like, you know, enough with you. So he says that in Washington, D.C. Then he goes 4 months later to, let's see, Mumbai. Goes to Mumbai and he's looking for business. And so now he's got to explain himself because it's like, wait a minute, didn't you just like hurt a whole bunch of low-income people in the United States and take their houses and cause dramatic injury and loss? And isn't this, you know, starting to happen again in Europe? Well, here's what he says. I regret that we participated in transactions that brought too much leverage into the world. It led to people taking too much leverage. But those were the standards of the moment, right? Not my problem.
About Greece.
Yeah, yeah. It's not. Everybody's doing it. We're innocent. You know, don't look at me. Okay. Now.
Well, he's
do have to get up and dance. Yeah, that's true. We'll have to find that for tomorrow. That's a classic. It must be on YouTube somewhere. Okay, now, in order to get to what happened, we have to deal with the concept of hegemonic power. And this is crucial for understanding the stage we are in history. Because we're at a point where basically the hegemon was, defined. This is a term that's come into use, and it was especially beloved of Charles Kinderberger, who was writing about things back in the 1930s and then continued, and in the 60s was defending the Bretton Woods system while it was coming under attack. And he said, look, a hegemon is, we're giving a gift to the rest of the world. The world needs a stable currency. We let the world use our currency. It's a gift we give the world. And then, in fact, he tried to argue in the mid-60s that basically by running a deficit, the United States was giving the gift of dollar surpluses that were there in the rest of the world, and so essentially those dollars could be used to buy goods and services in the U.S. or elsewhere. So he was, the gift was that we give you the liquidity you need. But the idea was that the U.S. was, by having the dollar pegged to the dollar, the global currency pegged to the dollar, they were somehow coordinating the global system. But that's no longer the case. The concept of hegemony now really shrinks to, first, the country that has the currency that's most used, the safest currency, and maybe tied to the fact that it's the country that has the most impressive and awe-striking military. And so basically, what you see in this period, in the shift from Bretton Woods, where you had the GATT, right, the General Agreement on Trade, Tariffs and Trade, and then you had the World Trade Organization trying to be set up. But what do we have now? First of all, think about the World Trade Organization. Did they ever get the Doha round done? Did they ever renegotiate? No, it's still not done. Still not done. And so what's been done in the meantime? Oh, I don't know, NAFTA, the KORUS, the Korea-U.S. trade, Colombia deal. Now there's TIP and all these other things that are being negotiated, right? And basically the thing I want to point your attention to is that these are not inclusive multinational deals. These are bilateral. At best, they involve regions, like say NAFTA, the 3 countries. So this is a hegemon that has the world's most powerful currency that's taking care of itself. In fact, that's on that basis that Europe is now backing away from the Europe-US deal. And meanwhile, the second element of hegemonic power as it exists today is Wall Street. This current account deficit that's existed from the 1980s until the present, this current account deficit means an inflow of money on capital account. We talked about this yesterday. But this means that basically there is the U.S. is a global liquidity sink. The money's coming in. And actually, I was at the Brookings Institution in the 1980s when this whole thing was going down. And at the Brookings, I was a student. I was a PhD research fellow, and so my job was to listen to the great people speak. And the great people were around the table there in the Brookings Institution, which is probably the most important think tank in Washington. They sat around the table and they were talking about Jörg Nihan's N-1 theory, the N-1 currency theory. Now, Nihan's had a book in which he was kind of a general equilibrium, monetary macro international theorist. And he noticed that paralleling Walras' law of markets, Walras' law of markets, right? If there's n markets and n-1 are in equilibrium, you're guaranteed that the last market is also in equilibrium. So one of those theorems that mathematical economists like to torture graduate students with. And he noticed, he said, well, the same thing would be true for currencies. Now, he was thinking, now this is Jörg Nihan's at Johns Hopkins, he's an equilibrium guy. He's thinking, well, if you've got n currency markets and n-1 are in equilibrium, so must the nth. But how about this? how about if you take the N-1 markets, and at the end of the day, there's a certain balance there. It could be, for example, that there's a surplus. Well, the nth nation has got to be a deficit nation. The structure of global demand and supply, as reflected through trades across borders, given existing exchange rates, means that there's a surplus there, and it must be compensated by a deficit in the final country. The nth country, so this became a kind of precept around the table of these negotiations and discussions that were happening in the lunchroom of the Brookings Institution. The lunchroom was, by the way, where everything was decided. You went there for coffee in the morning with your boss, you went there for lunch in the afternoon to talk, and then you went for a coffee in the afternoon to talk together. The whole place is one giant conversation deciding on U.S. foreign policy, economic policy, and so on. So basically they said, look, we're the nth nation. We have a global competitive advantage in consumption. And basically this is a stable system. So you can talk about twin deficits and you can talk about all the other problems, but it doesn't matter because the world economy needs us. Because if we're not there, the N-1 nations can't balance. Now if you think about that, that's true. And you say, really? So what does that mean? That means you're going to go global factory and you don't care. Yeah, it means that. It means that we can go, well, initially to the four Chinese, the four East Asian tigers, and eventually you crack it up and you crack open China, you go to China, and you go global factory, and you take a detour through Mexico, right? We stay for 5 minutes. Oh, we got NAFTA. Sorry. See you later. But you don't care because basically your people have increasingly cheap goods, and you're basically now appealing to them as the global consumers of last resort, no longer as the proud producers making Cadillacs, as I think it was Dan Seeger used to sing. So basically that's part of the system. And actually, here's the picture. You have basically I put there the inverse of the U.S. current account. So basically, it's above zero because it's the inverse. And so it's the negative of that. And you can see there's a direct correlation between the net foreign purchases of U.S. assets and the net current account deficit. I told you there's only like 1 or 2 laws in economics that actually work, and this is one. Most of it they make up, but this one, you can't hide from this one. And if we think about economic development, remember that this relationship holds at every spatial scale. So if you're thinking about neighborhood development, urban development, regional development, you're thinking about Chiapas, this relationship is going to be at work. So either people are bringing money across borders, so your people can buy, your people living there can buy goods that are made elsewhere, or else you got to reverse that. That thing holds all the time. Okay. So what we have now is competition for all nations, including the hegemon, for national advantage. So this is no longer the United States saying, oh yeah, we know the dollar is overvalued. It's the Bretton Woods system. We know it's overvalued and we have a deficit, but we're doing the world a favor, so we're the kind provider. No, this is the U.S. competing with everybody else. And of course, you see the face of that with Donald Trump. And kind of in an absurd way. The Clintons hide it more because there's more of a, well, I'm Bill Clinton, I love everybody, and come over here, let me give you a hug, but and Hillary doesn't actually channel it that well, right? But that mode of just aggressive confrontation and willingness to take on the world, which is an old theme in American foreign policy, is emerging again now, and it shows up in this period here. Now, the one thing about it is that there's no clear pattern that's going to work for the U.S. Nor for other countries. The situation is complicated in the era of the global factory, because where a good is made and where it's sold, that's a relationship. And you'll see, like for example, the East Asian nations, who've got about 50% of their trade with China, going through all kinds of permutations when China makes changes. So there's very complicated relationships amongst the nations in this situation, and especially because whether there's a high or a low currency no longer is such an indicator of whether you're going to have high currency, deficit on trade, low currency, maybe surplus on trade. That's not so true anymore, but in any case, these markets are now driven by financial flows and speculation. And so you have all the countries caught in all these games of flows and stocks. And we also see a situation in this world in which all the countries are deregulating. There's a lot more market forces. And so basically, what do you do? How do you, isn't it true that all nations are then subject to global forces? And isn't it then true that basically that prudence should be the way? Well, it turns out that if you look at this, no, because a power was imposed, and we're going to get to, this is our final topic for the day. This topic is the origins of the too big to fail doctrine. So essentially, I'm going to track this through U.S. law because, I'm going to argue here that it is only the U.S. economy that has a central bank that has the capacity right now to issue as much currency as it wants to save any financial crisis it wants to save. The ECB can't do that, the Bank of England can't do that, the Bank of Japan can't do that. Only in a limited extent, only the Fed can really be there as guarantor of the system. Now, this is not without contradiction. To the contrary, it's a global system built on contradiction. That's one of the problems we got right now. This whole thing is built on top of contradiction, layered on contradiction. But basically, go back to 1950, and there's a clause in the Federal Deposit Insurance Act. So this is the act that sets up that is the modernization of the deposit guarantees. And the clause says that the FDIC, the bank, whoever's in charge of the banks, can provide assistance where, quote, continued operation of the bank is essential to provide adequate banking service, unquote. Now, that is, if you read that clause, it's clearly indicating the case of an individual bank with individual bank customers. What they're trying to signal there is that we don't want bank runs. If your bank has problems, we will come and we will help you out. Let's not have bank runs like we did in the 1930s. But this thing gets generalized. Now, what happens here is that, okay, let's think about what is a too big to fail intervention. Okay, that happens when you have essentially a system of banks in which there's one or more large banks that are in danger of insolvency. They're chartered by a government that has the capacity to prevent them from failing. The action prevents the failure, so it works. So you promise that they're too big to fail. You ensure they're too big to fail. And basically, it's understood that you're doing this to save the system, not to save the bank. Okay, that's a too big to fail intervention. Now, a policy is a different thing. A too big to fail policy, thank you, is basically a pre-commitment to prevent failure for those financial intermediaries who are so important for your system that if they fail, they will compromise the integrity of your economy or your financial system. Now, there's some subtleties here if you think about it, because this policy depends on two untestable counterfactuals and one precondition, right? So first of all, the counterfactual is that you would imagine that the regulator will permit the failure of large banking institutions whose failure does not compromise the integrity of the system. So in other words, if it lets you fail, It will let you fail if you can't hurt the system. The second one is, and notice that that's a counterfactual, that's untestable, because how do you know it would have hurt the system? Because they saved it. What if they didn't save it? Well, then it wasn't going to hurt the system. And so it becomes the rationale for everything, right? But secondly, the second untestable counterfactual is that the failure of large banking institutions would compromise the economy. That is actually true. And if you remember the debates that came in 2008 when Lehman Brothers went down, and they were talking about the fact that they had let another institution almost fail, that was Bear Stearns, and they kind of worked that out and they kind of gave it away to Goldman Sachs, and they did this and that because they were scared to push that button on number 2. Nobody really wanted to know. But what if they'd let that bank fail? What if they let Goldman Sachs go away? What would have happened? Well, the thing is, we don't know, because basically it's impossible to know whether that counterfactual is viable. And the precondition for this policy is you never declare the policy. So it's Fight Club, right? The first rule of Fight Club is you don't talk about Fight Club. So the first rule of Too Big to Fail is we never talk about it. And so, yeah, it's just like that, right? And so that so what we have is basically, a situation in which the big banks are growing, and they're growing their way out of their problems. This is just a page that says, that essentially the banks, as we get into the 1980s, 70s, and 80s, they're moving past their challenges of being regulated banks that were threatened, and they're looking for new ways to make profits. And basically there's an easing of antitrust considerations. And in the US system, there was a lot of small fragmentary banks, and they're being allowed under the Reagan years, to merge together. And then actually what then happens is the savings and loan crisis, which happens at the same time as the savings and loan crisis is linked to actually the unstable macro environment that Paul Volcker creates. And then there's a crisis as well of some of the US banks in different states where there was a lot of oil revenue that also crashes down. And basically mergers are used as a vehicle for creating these big banks that for the first time in the US experience are almost nationwide banks. They're called super regional banks because the rules that came back from the Depression was that no bank could cross state lines. But that rule was eased, and little by little it was eased in these crises, and these banks like Bank One, Nations Bank, core states, First Interstate, First Union, came into being across state lines. And basically, these banks were growing, and there were these other money center banks that were regarded as systematically important. So you have this, what I'm setting up here initially, because it's where the story is going to go, it's going to go to the creation of the 6 mega banks that now dominate the global banking system. And they come from 2 rivers that are evolving in this time. One is that, like on one hand, you have these banks, and if you look at these names, like Bank One, Nations Bank at the bottom there, First Union, these are not names that exist anymore, right? And now they become other things. But just to say that, so this was a consolidation of the mass banking base over time. Meanwhile, there's these New York City, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles money center banks that are the hubs of the U.S. financial system. And basically, these banks were they lost their customers too, and so they basically went and they start making loans and getting involved, and the bottom of the page here tells the story. They go and they start making new loans, and then they get into this triple crisis. The triple crisis is, first of all, the savings and loan markets collapse. The housing market collapsed. The housing mortgage loans collapse. Rather, the institutions making the mortgage loans collapse because basically they've all made 30-year fixed-rate loans at 6% and suddenly, or 5%, in a world in which it's now going to cost 15 or 20% to borrow short-term money to make up your liability portfolio. It doesn't work. Then there's the Latin American debt crisis, and then along with that crisis, which is linked to the commodity collapse, we have the collapse in some of the U.S. states. Okay, now here's what it looks like in that period. And just for comparison purposes, this is just counting bank failures in the United States in that period versus now. And just to show you, we call this the global crisis there in 2008 and so on, but that was a crisis as well. That was a huge crisis. Lots and lots of institutions failed. Basically, let's skip that. And basically, they used these mergers and acquisitions to solve things out. But one of the banks that was in there was Continental Illinois Bank. Now, Continental Illinois was the 7th largest bank. It was headquartered in Chicago, Illinois. It was making it had become the largest, now C&I, commercial and industrial loans, the largest lender to business loans in the United States. And it was basically franchising a lot of loans through to banks in these areas that were linked to the oil crisis, to the oil bubble. And basically, it kept growing and growing with those loans. But because it was in Chicago, Chicago had a weird condition wherein Illinois, actually, in Illinois at that point in time, the 1980s, you had a unit banking law. Now, the unit banking law said that every bank can only have one branch. That's it. A bank is a branch, and a branch is a bank. And that includes the 7th largest bank in the United States. So they're not going to have a lot of deposits. How do they get their money? They're going to borrow the money in the money market. That's what they did. Now, in so doing, they then are making this huge amount of loans based on money market borrowings. And of course, what happens is that there's a run on the bank. Once all those triple crises hit, the savings and loan hits, and this is something that Claudia, I think, worked on, the Claudia Maya. And once that happens, and once the Latin American crisis happens, and so on, and the banks are looking shaky, and there is a kind of unwillingness of the money markets to lend to banks generally, especially to big banks, especially Continental Illinois, and they can't make their balance sheet. And so what happens is that these 16 large banks provide them with a line of credit, and the system is getting, very, very fragile. They open up a variety of things. They try to find somebody who's going to buy Continental, and they can't do it. Now what happens is that, so the system is literally shaking like a leaf at that moment in time. And there's a need to stabilize. The money markets are running away from U.S. banks. Now we're post-Bretton Woods. We have euro markets everywhere. We have a global system. We have the twin deficits for the U.S. economy. We have some structural weaknesses, and if you want to run away from the U.S. economy and run away from the dollar at a point where that financial system is looking bad, this is a good time to do it. And by the way, that's the period in which Japan is steadily catching up with the United States. I mean, when I was in post-grad study, there was a song called Turning Japanese, and there was all this thing about Japan and the passing lane. So it looks like you've got your competitor country right there. So let's leave this U.S. speculative hellhole that's just made all these bad loans to Latin America. Let's get out of there and go to another and a better place. So we got to stop that if we're running the U.S. economy. And so the comptroller of the currency was a guy called Conover. In 1984, John Conover, he makes an interview with the Wall Street Journal, and he lets this journalist called Carrington know that, well, don't worry, we're sure that between the FDIC and the large banks and the Federal Reserve, we're going to make sure that these banks are too big to fail. Now, which banks does he say? He says these 11. Now, check them out. Bank America, Continental Illinois, very large bank. Okay, now, I've got it listed there for a reason. Security Pacific National Bank, so it was actually 7th largest of this group, but I've got them grouped for a different purpose here. Citibank, Bankers Trust, and then J.P. Morgan, Hanover Manufacturers Trust, or Manufacturers Hanover, Manny, Chase Manhattan Bank, Chemical Bank, First Chicago, and finally Wells Fargo. Now, why the groupings? Well, because actually, if you want to look at the big four U.S. banks today, leaving aside Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs, you're looking at them. Those were mergers. Bank of America merged with Continental Illinois eventually, and they merged with Security Pacific National Bank in 1971, 72, or excuse me, 1991, 92. And then all of that number 6 through 10, that becomes JP Morgan Chase. That becomes Chase Bank. All that stuff merged together. Now, Bankers Trust basically suffers a lot of losses and gets taken over by Deutsche Bank. But basically, what he was laying out there was the future structure, the survivable structure of large banks in the U.S. Now, just a couple of things here. This was instantly discussed by the Shadow Financial Regulatory Committee, which came into existence at that point in time, the 1980s, and they talked about discipline and all this stuff, and they said, well, you know, we have to have disciplined markets, and we surely cannot make these guarantees to any bank, but we need deregulation because government regulation is always the problem. And so the attack on regulations was allowing these banks to merge more and more and more. What eventually happened is we talked about the regional, super regional banks, and then these designated super bank, you know, potential protected banks. What eventually happened is that these banks, the survivors, merged with the others, and they all came together. There used to be something called, at the level of the regional, super regionals, the bank was called Nations Bank. Nations Bank bought Bank America and then basically became Bank America. That's why you have Bank America today. And so on and so on. They all merged with each other and created these super banks. And it was all under the guise of deregulation. And this deregulation basically moves things forward in such a way that basically we say, well, we have to have exemptions for systematic risk. And basically they keep blaming the government itself. The major source of instability was the public sector. The government created the underlying causes by forcing S&Ls to assume excessive interest rate risk, and so on and so on. The banking debacle was primarily an example of government failure rather than a market failure. That's always the way, right? That's always the way that they do. And so, so a solution to a situation in which out-of-control banks generate a crisis is to tell the government to regulate less. But see, that's been the pattern. That's precisely the pattern. That's what happens in Korea when financial crisis emerges and they say to the Koreans, we will bail you out with IMF. We'll help you if you actually deregulate more. So rather than resolving the contradiction by putting the finger at markets that are out of control, they basically say the government needs to step back more. This happens again and again and again, and this in the context of a world in which we've now defined governments as merely players on the global stage, and if they're not good agents, they should be punished. Greece should be punished. Greece deserves to be punished. So does Argentina. Pay up, Argentina. It's just a hedge fund. You owe the money, right? You owe the money. So I'm going to skip this one here. What I'm going to show you here is just how the big banks got bigger. What we have is, if you look at, say, the scale of banks in 1981, take the 25 largest banks in the U.S. and rank them from largest to 25th largest and just compare them against each other. What happens with all the risks and all the problems of the crisis that emerges is that, you know, after the crisis period, basically the advantage of the top banks with the emergence of these super regionals and then the bailouts and all of that is that the advantage of the super big banks disappears a little bit, and you can see that they no longer dominate the banking world as they used to do. That's a consequence. So this change from here down to here records those years of crisis that they went through. Basically, though, just to say that this process of saying that, well, you know, we need to create large institutions, we need to create large banks because they're the only way to compete globally. This is a process that continues on, and in fact, a guy called Gary Stern, who is the president of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank, he identifies in 2004 31 banks that are too big to fail, and he comes up with a list like this. Now, I'm not going to make you read the list because it's too small, but just to say that you know, some of the big ones that continued were still there. Some of them merged together, but he now adds other banks to it. So there's more banks that are too big to fail. So what's happened is we have the pendulum between government and bank, and it swings more toward bank. Now there's even more that are sacred banks. And basically you can see how, again, mergers are used to put these things together to create larger and larger entities. And that's what happens. And so what we see is, okay, this is the picture we just had, where basically the most dominant banks were brought down into something like a competitive position with the others. But now look what happens. From 2000 there, we see that the big ones got bigger and bigger and bigger, and they restore their dominance. And basically, that dominance brings us to the way in which these banks operated and took chances that led to the subprime crisis, that have in turn led to the European crisis, and that have in turn led us to a world in which, think about it, every government is now being disciplined. We have a global problem of stagnation which is linked to global austerity policies. Every government on this planet is being asked to cut its budget. In England, they are cutting the NHS. Here, they are cutting payments for retired people. They are cutting all payments for retired professors. They are cutting salaries. They are making jobs less secure. Cut, 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 all across this world by these governments that are being disciplined by this system that has gotten out of control, and that whose main institutions are apparently so important that if we let them fail, the financial system at the heart of every economy will go down, and the world as we know it will cease to exist. Meanwhile, hyper-leveraged risk-taking is the calling card of these large institutions as they compete to make new sources of profits off of an escalating landscape of risk. The more risks there are, the more markets that are unstable, the more ways in which a person would need to protect themselves, because I want to trade with Colombia, but some of my goods come from Ecuador, and so I've got Colombia-Ecuador risk, I've got Ecuador-Mexico risk, I've then got interest rate risk in both countries, I've got risk, and so I can use all kinds of derivatives, and every time we need a new derivative to take care of a new source of risk, it's a new source of profit for one of these players in the financial center. Is it any surprise that they then turn to new sources of profits, and since it's no longer Latin America, they go hunting elsewhere? Now, and tomorrow we'll tell the story of how that's happened, but what you need to know is that the story tomorrow, part of the story tomorrow, is that they find this formerly financially excluded group, and they start making loans there. And then they start bundling and selling the loans, and those turn into subprime securities, and those subprime securities are spread throughout the world and then fail. And you think, okay, we learned a lesson. But actually, in some work, I'm not sure if I'll bring it tomorrow, maybe I'll try. What you can see is that the securitization and the tools of this modern financial complex, which have a lot to do with making arrangements and deals inside the complex, they exist. That's a machine that just needs raw material. Where's it going to look? Oh, I don't know. Why don't we privatize the land in the Amazon and securitize that? Why don't we buy futures on farm produce? Why don't we go and take more and more risks in, let's say, climate markets? All these things are sources of profit, and this is a system where the system is not set up to serve the many, it's set up to serve the 1% who's at the top of this, or the 10%, but basically you look at it and we now have winners and losers, and of course isn't that the mantra of Trump? You lose, you are fired, right? You're sacked, you're not good enough, you don't deserve to be on this planet. Because what's that planet for? Now we've come to this point. What I'm trying to do here with this history is to show you that these guarantees were set in motion to save a system that already was on uncertain ground, but then in a way created a temporary solution for getting through crises, the price of which is feeding ever more a financial complex that makes the world ever poorer for other purposes. So you read Thomas Piketty's book and you see the 1%, and then you say, Thomas Piketty, where does that 1% come from? And then we have the answer right here. Now, when we say we need a new global model, what are we going to do about this? You know, the Brazilians who were unable to go to Miami anymore because the real had gotten really low because of the global market's unhappiness with the Dilma Rousseff administration, who literally were writing in their Facebook pages, oh, hooray, now that Dilma's gone, we can afford to go to Miami again. Is that what that was all about? Just saying. Well, they now are using the Brazilian National Bank, National Development Bank, BNDES, is now being turned in short order in the 100 days that Michel Temer has had, is being now reimagined as a vehicle for privatizing yet more Brazilian companies. They're just doing what the market wants, and they want market recovery as Brazil's pathway to the future. It can't go like this, people. We need a new model, and we'll try to see if we can say something about that tomorrow. Thanks for your attention. Maybe open the floor.
Bueno, muy bien, muchas gracias, Gary. Creo que fue una conferencia magnífica. Vamos a pasar a las preguntas. Ya estamos por cumplir casi, ya diría, 30 años en que estamos bajo este modelo en que los mercados financieros están buscando crear ganancias, nuevas fuentes de ganancias, en que viejos activos se convierten rápidamente en nuevos activos que generan rentas para los mercados financieros. Y bueno, aquí está la universidad, muy pronto los préstamos estudiantiles serán también generadores de rentabilidad para los mercados financieros. Parece ser, ¿no es cierto? Entonces, vamos a pasar a las preguntas. Wesley, por favor, adelante.
I have 3 questions, 2 comments. First comment, thank you very much for the excellent presentation. I don't want to take anything away from yesterday, but today you gave such great information and analysis. Thank you very much. Again, I would like to perhaps borrow
A microphone.
So I have, if that didn't just break the recording. So I have 2 questions and a couple of comments. Thank you very much for the excellent presentation. I think I'll speak for myself. It was very useful for me, and I'm sure for everyone else. So in the spirit of reciprocation, in asking you if I could steal and give credit to you, obviously, for some of those great graphs, especially that one showing the post-colonial trends in lending. It says
Awesome,
1,000 words with that graph. So the first is a joke, is a Bill Blackism. You were talking about the rolling over a loan. There's the funny term. Well, we have the term, the rolling stone gathers no moss, like Jose Alfredo's Piedra en el Camino. And for the loans, the rolling loan gathers no loss.
That's true.
Interesting thing on Piketty and plutocracy, there's a Citibank 2002 memo, Welcome to the Plutonomy. Guess who they cite as their main influence? One Piketty. Interesting. So now the questions. You mentioned, first on the graph. When you showed that graph on international banking crises, it looked like it was half a banking crisis. I'm sure there was one. That's what I meant. Does anyone know what that one crisis was? Question 2. I'm sorry, this is all plumbing your great historical banking knowledge because I haven't found answers to these. The second, you mentioned that Volcker took out almost a mafia hit on Japan. Now, were you referring to the 85 Plaza Accords, or was there something more in the boom and the bust of that bubble where the Fed or Volcker was involved? Question 3, the last one. And this is the most historically speculative one. Someone of decent reputation, I'll tell you afterwards who it was, said that he remembered that during the renegotiations of the debt crisis, that there was some law, the United States banks, an antitrust law, that the United States banks could not negotiate in a block against their creditors, their lenders. And that to get around that, that is why they created the International Institute of Finance within the World Bank. So if that is true, if you could please elaborate on it, and if not, I'll shut up. Thank you very much again.
Doctor, I do really appreciate your presentation. It's really, really, I have not the word exactly to, I was like kind of shocked because, well, I want to make two questions in one comment. At the beginning, when I was beginning to listen to you, it seems to me like you were talking about a conspiracy. So, was like what is happening here? We are trying to understand how the world is working, but we are talking about conspiracies when we shouldn't be doing that. Well, and I am studying international relations. I know what this type of situations are, but it seems really shocking to me, but it was really interesting. And it's triggering me my ideas about what I am right now researching. Well, one of the questions that I want to make you is, if all these institutions are going for making more cuts in governmental budgets, there is one time that we are going to end up reducing everything, but we are making a merchandise of everything. So at the end, we are taking profit of everything. Actually, we are going to end up selling our own life, our own souls. I don't know how far we can go, our minds, I don't know. But my question is, how can you say you can try to make a new model when these financial institutions are not going to allow any type of regulations? Because since you said already that they consider they were in a depression, a regulated depression or a regulation depression, they are not going to allow themselves to have any type of regulations anymore, or they are not going to allow themselves to have any type of regulations when they know that they can merchandise or financialize everything. And the second thing, or the second question is, what did you mean by political legitimacy? You talk about political legitimacy, but I would like to talk about this concept, because actually it was not very clear to me. So I would like to know what were you talking about when you meant political legitimacy of this. I don't know exactly what you were talking about.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a question for you. We have 30 years with this economic model, and I would like to ask you, what do you think if it's possible to, in this context, the private banks could create money like a central banks?
Thank you again for your presentation. I have a question more related to the changes that caused the new model of the finance. I think we have seen just one side story of the thing, because you have shown us how that changes has happened, but not why. I see clearly that between you have said today and yesterday that the changes, as all I can see, occurs start in the 70s. But what were the forces that in the post-war and the Bretton Woods era that make that possible? And I mean because it seems that the growth of the finance occurs after before the deregulation. So in that sense, the institutional changes go after the economy really had changed. So if that it's what means, how we can think in a new model by the institutions when the institution is shows the changes that has happened already in the economy. And the other thing is what has happened with the real economy, because we haven't seen that and how that would fit in the picture of you show us. For example, in the whole world, probably excluding China and some other countries, but in the central countries, for example, the productivity of the economy has its growth has been less. So I think there are more deep problems, and that the finance is just an expression of that deeper problems, and so how we can connect that problems. Thank you.
I would like to thank you again for your nice lecture, and I was thinking about the graph that you show us, showing the colonial legacy per region. So it's quite a huge impact, knowing this kind of tendency or inertia we are still suffering. So thinking about that, I would like to hear a little bit about the mega banks in our region. So You talk a lot of the mega banks in the U.S., but thinking about this legacy, this colonial legacy, which one are the mega banks in our countries, and what kind of ruling they are putting on, and the kind of pressures that of these mega banks, these mega banks in our region is exercising on Latin American governments.
All right, let's we'll try to be quick here so we can maybe talk more, but these are great questions. Thank you. Actually, let me start with Wes's comment about Piketty and being mentioned in that Plutonomy book. You know, there's a debate that we were having. You know, I mean, think of, don't you, like, you're doctoral students and professors, so like Friday night, don't you get a bottle of wine, go out to the corner, hang out and talk about the global crisis? It's kind of what we all do, right? But one of those debates in that spirit, kind of a joke, but actually the debate that we were having, I was having with some friends, was could the growth of the global elite generate in country after country, generate a sufficient source of aggregate demand so that that could be a self-sustaining system within a broader system of misery. Now, you know, now notice that one of the things that comes in when you start to think about that is the fact that there may be people having their Gucci bags in a number of different countries, but you have to look at, you know, that each person with a Gucci bag is from a different country, and is it stable or not? What does it mean to be stable? But it's a question worth thinking. And of course, as you go in that direction, you can then think about, you know, how miserable can people be before there's a reaction? And part of it is, you know, the revolt of in a sense, not necessarily the 1% in Brazil, but let's call it the top 30% or the top 20%, the people who were thinking about plane tickets to Miami and who felt that they were unable to maintain that role and that privilege and that position in a Lula government and in a Dilma government that had been pretty effective at evening the odds. We were talking about the new middle class in Brazil. Very fragile, but it was there. So that it's worth thinking about that and systematically, I think. Secondly, man, I wrote down banking crisis, and this was your comment about the half a banking crisis.
Yeah, there was another graph before that one where I think about capitalism.
Oh, where there were, well, you know, that's because they're computing averages. Yeah, it's basically the average per year would be so low that across that time frame there must have been, oh boy, it looks like there wouldn't have been more than about 3 or something, which would be about right for that time period. Yeah, so that was the answer there. The Plaza Accords and the competition between Japan and the U.S. Actually, this is something that, as you know, is talked about a lot in Japan. And actually, what happened there was that there was the Plaza Accord where countries were agreeing that they would accept U.S. leadership, and Japan's arm was twisted, that they would pull their investments inward. And basically, after that point, there were pressures put through trade offices and through investment offices, all in a very subtle way. So that was the meeting, and it was followed by just being sure that we didn't have that kind of Japanese entry. And so the money flowed inward, and it blew up their economy. And of course, the contradiction's right there. You know, that's that's a chronic surplus economy. That means they got to, you know, basically what are you going to do with that money? Basically you're either going to build up your own assets or you're going to go elsewhere, but you're going to have a huge potential bubble problem. One way to think about Dymski, I've got a paper somewhere which I spatialized. I think it's really useful to spatialize Dymski. And if you think about these problems of flows of finance and so on, and flows of goods, and think about an economy that's basically like, take East Asia in the early 90s. You had a flow of monies in. Now the contradiction there is that that flow of money in means that that economy can live beyond its means. So the contradiction there is that one. When you have, like, on the other side would be Japan with a chronic trade surplus. And if Japan doesn't export and go buy stuff elsewhere, it's going to buy assets there. And if you're increasing the purchase of financial assets in a geographic space, in the context of a surplus, if you don't have more assets to buy, you inevitably are going to drive up the price of the assets that do exist. In other words, you have a ticket for a bubble unless you figure out some real assets that you can increase at that moment in time. Secondly, the IIF and the kind of World Bank and the coalitions, yeah, these things were put in place. It's a really watery line. It's an unclear line between formal action and informal action, but we're now seeing fewer and fewer actions that have the sanction of international law. Like, what's the G20? What's the actual status of the G20 as a legal force? But it's now G20 regulations that are closely linked to the BIS regulations, which in turn are closely linked to the Financial Stability Board. You say, the Financial Stability Board, where does that come from? Again, nowhere. There's no official status. So the IIF is yet another quasi-official, unofficial mechanism for coordinating global system. These are all ways of preventing the thing from collapsing, but they're very precarious in every case. Okay, on to Juan Maria. Okay, first of all, conspiracy versus system. And here's the thing, we have to walk a line. Because, for example, let's go with David Harvey, you know, the Marxian analyst. And David Harvey has a very clear, a kind of very generous-minded sense of Marxian crisis. He doesn't fall into, you know, it's a crisis of aggregate demand or inconsistency, or it's a long-run rate of tendency of the rate of profit to fall. He doesn't get into any of that. But basically, what David Harvey is always going to tell us is that no matter what is happening, it's a crisis of capitalism. And so, in some sense, everything that happens, we map into his crisis of capitalism. And the problem there, and I've been arguing with my friends in geography, is that everything that happens already is diminished in importance because it's just part of a bigger answer. And the answer is, you know, your world is terrible because it's a capitalist economy in crisis. We need to get rid of capitalism. And, you know, if we believe that and say, okay, but even, you know, if you, like, that's like the first 10 chapters of his books. Then you read that 11th chapter and you say, okay, what's going to happen next? And there's no answer for that. So we have to be careful about what we're insisting, in what way we insist on an answer from our own analysis. And I wrestle with this all the time. I don't think I've solved it very well. As I said yesterday, I'm kind of a Keynesian and kind of this and kind of that. But I mean, I can use Jeff Harcourt's famous phrase, horses for courses, but it doesn't help much. However, I think what I'd like to do, I mean, this thing that I'm presenting you should be a book. If I wasn't doing this big grant application this summer, would have had a time to begin putting all the pieces together. And I think that that book is not a book about conspiracy, but it's a book about the systematic emergence of a system, or an intersecting set of global systems that have certain consequences and implications as they work together. And I don't think that we need to say in that, like some of these people, you know, like that were, where's that? I didn't get into this guy much, but Kaufman, or these other people that started this, like George Kaufman and Edward Kane and so on. You could say, Edward Kane, you're a tool of the banking industry or something. But I don't think we have to do that or to say that, but I think that we do have to see that national power protects itself, financial power protects itself, and it has consequences and implications. Now, when without regulation, there are actions that are done that simply break the law, then we can say that there's criminality. Now, do we want to then say that it's a system of criminality, that this is nothing more than, you know, if we put bankers in jail, everything would be better? I don't know that that's helpful, because the interlocking systems are still there. This is something, actually, if you take a look at Jamie Galbraith's not most recent book, but the End of Normal, that book. He's got a chapter on finance where he goes with Bill Black, and he basically says it's fraud. The financial industry is fraudulent, and then he goes further and basically says, and Clinton allowed that, and Obama didn't stop that, and so they're all suspect. It's a system of global fraud. Okay, but what do we do with that? I don't know, but I would say we have to be careful there. Making cuts in everything. Second question, how do we make a new model when the financial power is there? You got to take care of the financial power. You can't have, you know, if we're going to maintain the double movement, that strange contradictory vision of Polanyi, you know, reacting to Popper and so on. If we're going to have the other side of the double movement, we need that to be a legitimate, empowered state, and then we seek the yin-yang, and it's never pretty, but the balance is somehow necessary. I think that we have to, either with, say, Paul Mason, you believe that new technologies will lead to blockchain, let's say, blockchain money that will remove money from the banking system, that peer-to-peer lending will remove their lending. And so we're going to eventually just watch the banks crumble, their power crumble, as people find cooperative solutions. I definitely have friends working on financial democracy thinking about that. Is that how that can happen? Can that change happen? How will the old order defend itself? Is it something like saying, how will the companies that own the horses and all the horse services, you know, do when the automobile comes? Well, they'll just wither and die. Will it be like that? I don't think so, because there's something special about money in these economic systems. And so that means you got to regulate them, you got to cut them down, or you got to go to a global system that nobody's ready for. Your point about political legitimacy, let's take that up after we're done, just because I didn't remember saying that, and so let's go to that later. We just find it and clear it up. Secondly, could we have private banks create public money, or create money as central banks do? Well, this kind of goes to the other end of the Polanyi story. What if indeed we move toward a world in which national power is permanently compromised? And you know, we look at nation after nation. Look at India right now. What a mess. Look at China, kleptocracy, right? Is it on its last legs? I don't know. They can kill their people faster than they can, you know. Let's look at South Africa. Let's look at Brazil. Who did I miss? Russia. No. We're going BRICS. Russia. Okay, we're done with the BRICS. That was a good ride, right? Yeah, then we go to the, I mean, you know, it can't stay like this for sure, But these are nation states that are not competent to govern in many cases beyond taking care of their own embedded elites. Now, if that's the world, this goes to another, this is another Friday night bottle of wine on the corner with your friends. All right, this is a debate we used to have in the community reinvestment movement. Because we were sitting there in community reinvestment trying to put pressure on these big banks to do the right thing. You know, reinvest in the community. Quit saying you can't make a loan there because there's black people there or there's brown people there. You know, come on now. But the other point of view, so one view was, yeah, we got to put pressure, pressure, pressure. The other point of view was to say, well, you know, the heck with them. If they don't want to lend, let's just get them to at least put some money in a fund and let's control that fund. Okay, now in the same spirit, if the banks today are not lending, which we know they are not, who's doing most of the loan growth in Europe right now? Hedge funds. Right? So you say, so should we try to create, you know, beneficial hedge funds? Now, a hedge fund's a weird legal entity, right? But then could you have an asset management firm that's going to do the right kind of investment? And what if that's not a bank? Do you need to worry about what the banks are? Are we then making them wither away by pulling our money out and taking it somewhere else? Now, you ask an even more radical question, though, which is that what if they start trading and making, well, let's say making money in the spirit of, you know, we now have, you know, red pen money. And it's some kind of, it's a paper money or something, but we now start to make this traded, and and then we're going to make loans, so we'll have endogenous red pen money, so it functions like a money, which kind of is if I can have a minute just on, there's a debate that's being had in Europe, in England right now, in Britain, where there are some people who are taking the view that the way to get rid of the power of the banks is basically to eliminate their money-creating property and just allow them to buy money from the markets and then make loans on that basis. So they basically turn into funds. So the whole thing turns on a money market basis. I think that's a problem because there's no flexibility in that system. So for our red pen economy to work, I think we're going to have endogenous red pen money creation. And that means that it's going to have to be readily accepted everywhere. We'll have to have networks of people and businesses who will accept the red pen. And that's the problem that has to be solved with the private money, is the incompatibility of monies. Now, there was if you're interested in this topic, I would urge you to go to a debate in the 1960s, or excuse me, 80s. Fisher Black was one of the contributors to this. And then there was a guy called Tyler Cowen. Well, there is a guy called Tyler Cowen. He's now at George Mason. And there was his buddy, too, Cowen and something. If you want to check it out, I think we could find it online in a minute. They called it the New Monetary Economics. In the argument, this was Fisher Black. Okay, so Fisher Black of the famous formula, you know, he's probably a guy that did his share of smoking dope on the corner and drinking wine, talking about things, you know, back at night. But so he would think in a kind of visionary way. It's a really interesting book about him by Perry Merling, you know, celebrating his life and his ideas. But one of those ideas was, if we have financial markets that are efficient, really efficient, then except for the scale problem, then we all can value every good that we see instantaneously, in principle, knowing that its price represents its true value relative to everything else. So everything could trade for everything. Everything could be money. Now, they tried to push that idea, and as I mentioned, it's a really interesting debate. But I think it goes to the heart of this question of, could you then create a private money, would be a variation of that. And if we talk for a minute afterwards, there's another guy at Chicago, I'm forgetting the name right now, Townsend. Townsend has some interesting work on, he just adds transaction costs and thinks about monies and the creation of monies and so on. So Townsend does some pretty interesting stuff, even though he's a Chicago economist. And Carlos, let's see. What were the forces that made the changes in the system possible? And you kind of got into a riff about that institutional change happens after the economy changes. And you kind of went in several directions with that. Okay, first of all, there is a sociologist whose name begins with S. There's Admati at Stanford University, who writes some pretty interesting stuff about banking. But then there's this sociologist as well. I'm going to say like Schnitter, but that's wrong. We could find the name. I'm sorry for that. But she wrote a book that actually is very close to the analysis I gave you. And actually, if you take a step back, or if you look at some of the things that go along behind the story of the PowerPoint, we both tell the same story, and Anmati does too. It's a story in which basically problems in these financial systems emerge, like the breakdown of the money markets in 1970 with the Penn Central crisis. They've got all the instruments are regulated, and everything is regulated, including the rate on the jumbo CD. And basically, the Penn Central Railroad Company, big railroad company, melts down, fails, the money markets melt down, the Fed wants to save the money markets, but everybody's running from the money market, and the Fed's got nothing that it can use to solve the problem because they've overregulated too much and they didn't count on the crisis. So that's when they deregulate the jumbo CD. That opens the door to the money market mutual fund. That opens the door. So one failure, so there's kind of systemic cracks that open, leading to rules and regulation changes that lead to institutional adaptations, that lead to the change of the markets, that lead to further cracks. So actually, to me, it's a dialectical process that goes. Now, what you injected, and you got to this at the end of your question, was a kind of, I think, a deeper belief that I think you would accept that argument, that at that level that's happening. But the thing that you said that goes deeper than that is the notion that it really is about the economy going through changes and fluctuations as the real sector goes through its dynamism or its failure. And then we have to link up the story of how do the different ways in which people generate, let's say, output that's valued, and the ways in which this can become a Schumpeterian innovation that spreads throughout an industry and transforms everything in the way that the computer did. And where are we on that scale today? I would just say two things. One is that there was, again, a 1980s debate that was very interesting on the ways in which the computer industry, the PC, should be classified. It was initially classified in services, and then there's a long debate about what exactly was the implication and meaning of the PC in terms of the chain of technological progress. We could ask the same question today about the smartphone, or we could ask it about the app, etc. It's an interesting question. And then secondly, I would just point you to the new book by Robert Gordon that tells this long story of what he says is declining productivity growth and the argument that the days of rapidly growing capitalism are over. I have a lot of friends who are having yet another street corner debate. This is a debate between people who agree that we need environmental sustainability. Some of them grab the bottle of wine and they have a swig and they say, we can reinvent infrastructure, we can reinvent housing, transportation, all the systems that connect us, and in so doing, there are our investments, and they're green investments. So it's not that we'll have a world with no work and no dynamism and no economy. It will be a transformed world. The other corner on that debate is the vision that no, as my colleague at Leeds, Dan O'Neill, put it, enough is enough. We need degrowth. We need to consume less, to be simpler and all of that. And that debate is another really important and unresolved debate. So I'll leave that one there. And I think the final question from Monica is mega banks in this region. Hi. First, a confusion happened. I was suspecting it was time to stop when I got to this point of it. So I kind of went fast. But when we go from that's the list. When we go from that smaller list to the bigger list, you'll notice that if we look there at the firms on that table, we're going to start to see some banks that have position in Mexico, just as we see them up here. And the same thing would be true, Santander in Brazil, Santander here, BBV, et cetera, et cetera. And so you see they're not on the top of the chart, but they're probably somewhere. Story of these big banks is that, first of all, they compete for the same kinds of customers in the large, more prosperous markets. So they compete for customers, first of all, to offer integrated services, and there'll be gifts they'll give, like free accounts or other things, so that you hold your money there. The second thing is that they have competed in various niches in the markets. For example, the market for precarious lending to lower income people. There's a lot of subsidiary companies of these big banks that compete there, not through their own name. The loan growth is, the loan portfolios of these banks is very bad. Brazil and Mexico have terrible records at the banks actually making loans. And one of the things that we see, in fact, in both countries is that a lot of the credit that's given for businesses is actually brokered by banks, but not done by banks. And so banks have, in some sense, lost their function as lenders and reimagine it to some extent as brokers. The problem there, of course, is that a broker-type bank only works for established companies. So there's always the problem of how do you get small and medium enterprises going again. And no bank wants to touch that problem because it's costly. For that, we need development banks and a commitment by a government that's powerful enough to make that work and put that commitment into its budget. And we don't have that right now. So I would also say that these banks will leave these markets as they consolidate. And there's a question about what is a bank anymore. And I did a talk last night at the administration school where one of the points was that, the core banking services are no longer necessarily at the core of what these institutions do. They could walk away from transactions and they could walk away from loan making and still be dominant financial forces. And that may very well be the direction we're seeing. Okay, I'll leave it right there. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Professor Gary, for this excellent and really great exposition for today. Solo quiero recordar para todos ustedes que mañana terminamos esta serie de tres conferencias del doctor Gary Dymski aquí en el posgrado, y mañana por la tarde a las 5 de la tarde en la sala David Ibarra de la Facultad de Economía en el tercer piso del edificio B tendremos también una conferencia del doctor Gary. Ya no me acuerdo sobre cuál es el tema, por acá Valeria me tiene que recordar. Entonces los esperamos mañana a las 12 aquí y a las 5 de la tarde en la conferencia en la David Ibarra. ¿De acuerdo? Muy bien, pues muchas gracias a todos y un aplauso más para Gary, por favor.